there's only one training method you need to understand to sprint faster, and everything else is a waste of time until you understand this one concept. So in this video, I'm gonna show you the simple training formula I use to help my athletes go from this to this, and this to this. And I'll also provide example exercises, reps, and sets. And at the end of this video, I'll give you a simple screenshotable formula you can take a picture of so you can refer back to every time you make a workout for your speed. While recording this video, I realized that my mic wasn't plugged in, so the first half of the video is gonna have a terrible mic that's gonna sound very echoey. I apologize, but then the second half of the video is going to be coming from this actual microphone because I realized I made a mistake. The main goal when sprinting faster is improving something called power. By the way, I can't draw or write, so if you can't see this, hopefully when I edit this, I can give some type of ways to make this more. And when you hear people talk about power, they're usually referring to force times velocity. So force multiplied times velocity. But everyone says that. Everyone knows that force times velocity equals power, but what does that even mean and how do we train it? And I'll show you how to train power specifically for speed because not all power is the same. A lot of research states that there's multiple types of power. There's peak power, there's optimal power, there's velocity-based power, and there's even eccentric power. But what does this all mean and how do we train it simply with a simple formula to increase our speed? In just a bit, I'm gonna give you the simple formula I used on my athletes to run 10.3 laser time in the 100 meter. I had an athlete who wanted to go Division I for track and field, but he could only run 11.2 seconds in the 100 meter. And that doesn't sound bad until you realize he only had 2 years left to improve his speed to run the times he needed to go Division I. He focused on improving power. He did hang cleans and snatches, which are known for developing power through triple extension, and even increased his power clean to 280 pounds with perfect technique, even though his body weight was only 170 pounds. Although he was improving power, he did not get faster on the track because he was only focusing on vertical based power, which basically means you're producing power in a up and down motion, which is vertical force. But once we use our elastic based training system and implemented power in different directions, we got him from 11.2 to 10.36 in only 8 months of speed training. When we're trying to develop power for sprinting faster, the goal should be horizontal power. That is still force times velocity, but instead of a vertical orientation, so vertical force production based exercises, it's horizontal force production based exercises. The goal in sprinting faster is developing horizontal power, which like we said earlier in the video is force times velocity. Now we split these into two categories. We can individually train force and individually train velocity, which will develop power. Let's start with how we train force specifically for horizontal power, which is how we're gonna increase speed. The number one way we're gonna increase force for horizontal power is going to be resisted sprints. But this resisted sprints is going to be with a specific load. In the past, I used to teach 10 to 20% of your body weight, but now I've changed my mind. If your goal is to develop force, which is strength, right? This is sport-specific strength to speed, then we need to be going much heavier. And since we're going with a strength stimulus, I actually want a velocity drop-off. So that's how much drop-off your time is by 30 to 50%. In the research, we call this VDEC, all right? So if you have a way to test your VDEC, which is velocity decrement, then you can go ahead and try to look for a 40 to 50% velocity decrement with the JP Morgan formula. But if you just want to use body weight, it's around 50 to 60% of your body weight. But if you're around 130 to under 200 pounds, this is probably gonna work for 90% of people. And to try to get as specific as possible, if you're very weak, maybe go on the 30 to 40% side. If you're really strong, then go 50 to 60% of your body weight. And now that you know you need to do resisted sprints, how much volume do you do? Maybe around 6 sets of 20-yard sprints or somewhere around that nature. We're going 80 to 120 yards worth of total sprinting with the resisted sprints. High rest, 1 to 2 minutes between every single set. And you need to remember, this is not going to improve speed. This is going to improve strength. And we know also in the research that strength doesn't automatically translate to speed. But this is the most sport-specific force or strength that you're actually developing. So this is a strength stimulus that you also pair with body weight sprints, which actually increases your speed. So before we're moving forward, this is increasing force, and that is going to eventually lead to power, which will eventually lead to velocity, which is speed. So in the middle of every single circle is going to be the core exercise you should be doing. Resisted sprints, heavy band resisted sprints, hill sprints, parachute sprints, something where you're resisting. Even a friend that's pushing on your shoulders while you're running forward as hard as possible, that type of stuff can work too. But then on the outside of the circle, we're gonna have supporting exercises that will also improve horizontal power. I had to make the circle bigger because I don't know how to draw, and I'm still bad at drawing. This looks terrible, but we're gonna make this work. So on the outside, the supporting cast, right? The supporting exercises to help develop horizontal force is gonna be stuff like full range of motion lifting, so full ROM, full range of motion single leg lifting, then horizontal plyos like broad jumps, even we'll put down here a banded 3-step. So that's when you have a band around your hip and you sprint for 3 steps. And then you need vertical jump exercises as well, right? So I know we talked about horizontal plyometrics or horizontal power, but we can even do some vertical jump stuff, which is like non-counter movement jumping. So that's when you pause with no stretch shortening cycle and then you try to jump as high as possible from like a squatted position. So non-counter movement jumps. A good example would be man, I cannot write for shit. A good example would be a seated box jump, right? Where you're pausing and then you stomp as hard as possible. Even drotch jumps would help as well. And then for the force side, the last things we would do would probably be resisted jumps. Now for these type of resisted jumps, we're doing the deep knee. So obviously I'm gonna have B-roll, but these will be deep knees. So not like resisted pogos, but we're actually getting into like a half squat or quarter squat position and going for as much height as possible, not really the speed off the ground. Because like we said, we're trying to develop force that later turns into power. So we're not training velocity. This is just pure strength and force type of stuff. Really good for the athletes who feel weak and unathletic, who need to develop that strength side. We're not just gonna spam deep squats like what you see on most social media posts. We're actually gonna develop force that's specific to sprinting, which would be resisted sprints, banded 3 steps, broad jumps or band resisted broad jumps, full range of motion single leg lifting, for example, like a rear foot elevated split squat, resisted jumps that are in a half squat or quarter squat position, or non-counter movement jumps where you're pausing and then you jump. You can even do band assisted non-counter movement jumps where you're holding on with the band, you pause into the half squat position and then try to jump as high as possible. Or you can even use like a rim and try to touch rim with a pause. And once again, the athlete who ran 10.3 in the 100 meter, I use mainly this side of the force equation because he's a muscle dominant athlete. If you're an elastic dominant athlete, you should probably be training power and velocity. But if you're a muscle dominant athlete, you naturally put on muscle easily, you're more strength based, and you probably want to stick to force, power, and slightly microdose the velocity side. So you want to add in some velocity, but usually it's going to be power and force. He was a muscle dominant athlete, but I'm going to show you how to train velocity because I had a guy who was #1 in the state in triple jump. I'm going to show you his story and how he trained velocity, and then we're going to link it to power. I use this basic formula to help thousands of athletes break 5 seconds in the 40-yard. And the topic we're about to talk about helped this athlete win state in triple jump. And also this overall formula helped this athlete break 11 seconds in 100 meters. So if you want me to apply all this for you in a monthly speed training workout, click the link in the description or the pinned comment to join the Speed Academy. Now let's talk about the velocity category. How can we specifically train velocity to force an adaptation that most people want? People who struggle with velocity are going to love this, right? The #1 way to train velocity is going to be flying sprints. A flying sprint is when you build up for 10 to 20 yards and then you have a timed cone session. So if you could time it or put cones down and record it and then figure out the time afterwards, you have a timed session of 10 to 20 yards after a 10 to 20 yard buildup where you go from slow to fast. You hit that fast, you reach your peak speed at the first cone, and you sprint as fast as possible through the cone while trying to time. So you can measure it and then try to improve from that measurement. You'll get max intent. And the reason why we time this and why it's so important is because you need max intent. You don't need fancy equipment. You just need your phone. You just need a way to tell when your hit passes the first cone and the second cone. So beginners can do flying 10s. Intermediates can do flying 20s. And the best way to improve your max velocity is probably flying 30s, right? This is the way I use for most of my athletes. Now, flying 30s can be pretty rough for some people because you're sprinting almost 60 to 70 yards. So if that's too much for you and it takes longer than 5 to 6 seconds for you to sprint that flying 30, it's just not worth it for you, all right? You can stick to the flying 10s, flying 20s. That is a very potent way to improve velocity. And do not jump to the 20s and 30s if you're slow because you're just gonna be developing slow twitch fibers if you jump to the 20s and 30s because you're gonna be sprinting for too long, enforcing bad habits, and you're not gonna be sprinting fast enough to get the stimulus you need to improve your speed. Now, I said I was only going to do one exercise in the middle, right? The core exercises, but there is one more core exercise for velocity that is just as good as flying sprints, and that is 40-yard timed sprints. This is key, once again, because we talked about the timing already. We know why it's important. But 40 yards, you actually hit max velocity around 25 to 30-yard range. So you get about a flying 10 or flying 20 around that 20-yard range to 30-yard range. So you're going to get a good flying 10 or flying 20, but you're also sprinting as fast as possible, timing it. So you're getting upright sprinting, you're also getting acceleration. So this is probably one of the best ways to improve your velocity. And for volume, if you're doing 40-yard sprints, it's about 80 to 150 yards of total sprinting for a session. If we're flying 10s, usually about 5 to 10 sets will do the trick. Now, what are the supporting exercises for improving velocity? We have fast ground contact time plyometrics. So I'm just gonna put fast GCT. All that means is ground contact time plyometrics. So this is popping off the ground like jump rope or pogos. Now we have technical stuff, right? We have technical stuff like dribbles and wickets. We also have light sled sprints, so we do not want to go heavy here. We talked about VDEC earlier. This would be around a 10 to 15% VDEC, or honestly, 10 to 15% of your body weight will also do the trick. So we'll go light sleds, and then we'll go 10 to 50% body weight. Some good examples of, by the way, I talked about fast ground contact time plyometrics. Good examples would be bounds, right? So bounds improve velocity a ton. Bounding, pogos, and then another version would be drop jumps, right? So dropping off a box and going for height and speed. So now that we have force and we have velocity, now it's time to mix the two and train power. And it's not the same as the force exercises, not the same as the velocity exercises. It's probably some of the best exercises you'll ever see to train your power, especially horizontal power. To train power in the middle of the circle, we're going to be doing sled sprints once again, but it's 40 to 50% VDEC. I will make a separate video on how to actually calculate VDEC with just the phone without all the fancy equipment. If you're going off body weight, it's different for everyone, but around 50 to 60% body weight is going to work for most people. What's also important is that this is still a strength movement. This is not improving velocity. This is improving, in the research, something called optimal power, right? Horizontal power, which is a strength movement, a strength stimulus that eventually transfers well over to velocity. Right, so it has some force or some strength-based parts of it, and it also has some velocity-based parts of it because it's light enough where you can still get some good speed in. So it's training velocity and it's training force, and that's what we call power. Now for the supporting exercises, it's still the same as force and velocity, but we're making some small changes. For broad jumps, we're actually gonna do something like triple broad jumps. So we're still getting the strength or force development from the broad jump, but we're adding reactivity or velocity by adding multiple broad jumps and using that stretch shortening cycle to repeat the exercise. Now, instead of regular pogos or resisted half squat jumps, we're going to do resisted pogos, or bouncing off the ground fast, right, for velocity, but we also have the force aspect, which will challenge power. So I called it res pogos. I also have a photo that'll look way cleaner than this. Now we had non-counter movement jumps in force, and we had drop jumps where you drop off a box and pop off fast in velocity. So for power, we're gonna do something called def jumps, which challenges force and challenges velocity because you're dropping off a box, trying to get off the ground fast, but trying to jump as high as possible, which develops force. And another variation we can do is something called Viking med ball drop jumps. I'm just gonna call it a Viking jump. And then in terms of strength training, when we talked about velocity, there was no strength training because velocity is simply too fast. You're on the ground for 0.1 to 0.2 seconds in sprinting. There is no strength that directly improves speed, but we can improve power that transfers to speed. And the way we do that is 40 to 60% of our body weight. So this is medium body weight lifting. So right here, I just did 40 to 60% body weight, let's say speed squats, half squats, quarter squats, or even 40 to 60% trap bar high pulls. Any variation where you're trying to produce force from this half squat position, 40 to 60% of your weight is gonna be the best for optimal power, which is a strength stimulus, not a velocity stimulus. This 3-circle formula is how you get faster. And traditional strength coaches will tell you need to start slow and heavy. You need to build the base. That's force. We're gonna start slow and heavy and slowly transition to fast and light, which is velocity. But you need to remember that we're building strength that is sprint specific. So we're building strength with single leg lifting and resisted sprints. And then we move to power, we're not just doing hang cleans or snatches, we're doing horizontal based power movements like a def jump, a Viking jump, sled sprints that's 40 to 50% VDEC, 40 to 60% squats, or triple broad jumps, band resisted triple broad jumps, resisted pogos, momentum pogos, stuff that challenges power in a horizontal orientation. And then we will do these type of exercises to develop velocity-based power. So this is the velocity side of horizontal power, but it's flying sprints, drop jumps, bounding, pogos, light sleds, 10 to 50% of your body weight, or even dribbles and wickets on the technical side. And it's very popular on social media for people to say you need to surf the force velocity curve. Some coaches say that's bullshit. Some coaches say it's not. Well, guess what? This is how we surf the force velocity curve. We go from left all the way through the middle, arrow. This is surfing the force velocity curve. Yes, this is very messy, but this is how you go from force to power to velocity. Maybe you go back to power, maybe you stay in velocity, but this is surfing the force velocity curve for getting faster. And if you do this the right way, not everyone needs to be in force, not everyone needs to be in velocity, not everyone needs power. You find your weakness by timing your sprints, doing a resisted sprint profile, watching my other videos to see what you struggle with, and then you stay in that category until you get an adaptation. An adaptation means your body adapts to the stimulus you're giving. So you need to get stronger. Squatting or doing these type of exercises will make you stronger. And then once you realize you're strong, then maybe you need to move to power or maybe you need more velocity. Find your weakness and stay in that category for as long as possible. Or for 90% of athletes, just surf the force velocity curve for speed. On the screen, there probably is some type of basic thing you can screenshot to show all of this in a much cleaner fashion.